Maybe I can start slowly. I can see people are still coming, but so I can start by presenting how we're going to do this panel, this last hour of the conference. So welcome back to the last hour of this conference, which is the plenary session for teams 5, 6, and 7. So let me share my screen. Okay, so how we're going to run this plenary session. So we're going to have a short summary of each session, team 5, team 6, and 7. And then we're going to go through Q&A. So basically, before we start, sorry, I apologize. My name is Lauriane Chardot. I'm the manager of the Community Engagement Office at the Earth Observatory of Singapore, and I will be your host for this last hour of the conference. So I will slowly let the panelists introduce themselves in 1 or 2 sentences. Maybe Adam, you want to start?
Sure, I can start. Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Switzer. I'm one of the co-chairs of the AOGS-EGU Conference on Natural Hazards. I'm an associate professor at the Earth Observatory of Singapore, and my primary interest is coastal hazards, including storm surges and tsunamis. So I'm happy to contribute. Thanks, Adam.
So then we have, hopefully, Gayatri. Are you here from Team 5?
Yes, I'm here from Team 5. I'm Gayatri Malayani. I'm an assistant professor at Geological Engineering Department, Universitas Gadjah Mada in Indonesia. And I'm interested in studying active tectonics, earthquake geology, and also including earthquake study, earthquake-related study. Thanks.
Thank you, Gayatri. Heidi from Team 6.
Yeah, my name is Heidi Kreibich. I'm head of the working group Flood Risk and Climate Adaptation at the German Research Center for Geosciences in Potsdam in Germany. So I'm an environmental engineer by training, and my work is mainly focused on risk modeling of inland floods, so riverine floods, and in combination with flash floods, pluvial floods, so urban aspects, but also in respect to multi-hazards. So I looked at the combination of floods and droughts a lot. I also looked at combinations on landslides and floods, but also on the occurrence of earthquakes, storms, and floods in the same region.
Thanks a lot, Heidi. And finally, we have Nico Fournier from Team 7.
Kia ora, everyone. My name is Nico. I'm a volcanologist by trade, I suppose, and I head the group that monitors the volcanoes in New Zealand for GNS Science. So I'm basically heavily involved in science advice to governments, from prime ministers down to pretty much ground level and boots on the ground. So quite a large interest in that. From a science point of view, my field of expertise is around volcanogeophysics and physical volcanology. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. So I hope you all had very fruitful discussions in your breakout rooms. So I think the idea right now for about 5 minutes each, so namely Gayatri, Heidi, and Nico, or myself, to represent Team 7, we're going to summarize in hopefully 5 minutes what we discussed in each session. So then that will lead to a more insightful panel discussion. So do you want to start, Gayatri? In a few minutes.
Sure. I can share screen, right?
Yes.
Is anyone able to see my screen all right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here I am just try to give you a summary of what we discussed in session 5. So we have 2 excellent talks. The first talk is by Bill Fry from GNS about still tsunami and how the next generation of tsunami forecasting. So Bill gave us an overview of how it conduct in New Zealand using dot array system, and this is the map showing where the array are, and then using that they able to do the modeling and then also step down grade in the forecast as the event evolve. And so Bill also point out several take out some challenges, like for example, like how to build faster and more certain model, what data needed and what can be pursued. For example, like obtaining ocean cable data, obtaining data through ocean cable network, and also how to translate the result to the emergency response community, and that's also the challenge that he raised. And then we also have a second excellent talk by Song Ho Yoon about the utilization of the satellite imagery, for example, like using radar for rapid response in an event of disaster. And like this is a quick example of what he did. They did, the group did, and using a pre and after satellite imagery of after an event, and then using that to develop the quick assessment of the impact of the hazard, and also use the rapid validation from the crowdsourcing that they can use, and then provide like some excellent example on how they actually work, like from the observation through satellite, and then also from ground observation from the people observation in real time. And so it's very useful in terms of now like the rapid response to event. And also after that, we have two breakout sessions in different groups. So the first room discussing about there are several important issues that raised, for example, like what the benefit of everyone having access to cell phone, and so push notification of an event and foregoing event is a big innovation, as the warning reach many people instantly. In for example, like a successful example through the Pacific tsunami notification system, and also to increase the model accuracy, like what can we do, what can we get. For example, like if you want to use the existing infrastructure, for example, like using communication lines, the ocean bottom, the ocean cable communication that is already available, then is it possible to put sensor on the network? And to do this, then it needs some governmental level negotiation. And also there's some hazard that the result from the scientists is having this uncertainty. And so when you try to translate the uncertainty to the policymaker, or like it can't be like directly translated. So it needs to be working on that as well. And also like development for some apps to move the hazard information in real time is also could benefit, like visualize and communicate the probability maps in a clear and acceptable, understandable way to the community, to so that people more understand. And then there's also few other points that we try to discuss, like how to close the gap for the country with less resources, how the interaction between to balance that is also what we discuss. And then in room 2, I might there's like the importance of the pre-event communication and relationship building before, like you can tell people that something that is already happened, and you need to like build the trust to the people, and like how you using the social media and crowdsource information to work on the validation effort. And I think like there's like something that needs to be further discussion. I just point out here, there's the uncertainty of the unknown communication forecasting scenario to public, or we should just remove the uncertainty or drop it somewhere, but but the question is like where should we put the scientific uncertainty into the like, if we want to remove that, then we need to find a way. And then also quick important is also like enhancement of local capacity building by supporting local expertise and professional, I think is also important in risk reduction, because then they can be sustainable in a way of like facing the future disaster. Like how you could do that, then you can do the through training from like well-developed, like well-known expert into the transferring knowledge to the local capacity will increase that way. And also it's important to do the scientific practice of researchers from outside of the country in terms of disaster response, like how we could establish involvement of local researchers in fair arrangement in a way that is not something that scientifically not mismatched. And also increased coordination between scientists, engineers, social scientists, and policy development is also need to be established. And so that's from teams 5. And if you're still interested, we still open the Padlet, and so everything is there. You can see it using this link. Thank you. I hope I did not over 5 minutes.
Thanks, Gayatri. No, that's great, because I think I can see already overlap, at least with my theme 7 session. So that's going to be an interesting panel discussion. Heidi, do you want to share in a few minutes what's discussed in your session?
Yes, sure. And I can only echo you. I've seen a lot of overlap of what we discussed in our topic about multi-hazards and risk as well. So we also started off with a very interesting talk by Professor Goda from the Department of Earth Sciences from the Western University of Canada, who focused on coastal communities under multi-hazard earthquake tsunami risk. And the main aspects what he presented in his talk was about uncertainty assessments along the whole risk chain of such multi-risk assessments, as well as on tsunami evacuation. And there the challenge is how to bring in behavioral aspects of the individuals via agent-based modeling and link these ABM models with risk models, which also is associated with quite high uncertainties. And so in the discussion, we focused on a couple of challenges and tried to collect ideas how to tackle this challenge. And as triggered via this talk, we discussed about these high uncertainties which are associated with multi-risk assessments, since the uncertainties are propagating through all these components, from hazard to exposure assessment to damage, and then the overall risk assessment. So often this leads to really high uncertainties. On the other hand, we also deal in this multi-risk domain with low probability but high risk events and how to deal with these. And so we discussed a few ideas. So one important aspect is, of course, first of all, to quantify the uncertainties so that we know actually with which range of uncertainties we have to deal with, and the importance to communicate these at least to the decision makers. On the other hand, we discussed to come up with probabilistic modeling approaches, which help also to inherently quantify the uncertainties and to replace these, more or less old-fashioned deterministic approaches. On the other hand, we also discussed an approach to come up with realistic storylines. So what different triggers could lead to such cascading events? And so to develop realistic scenarios which we have also not observed before, but which are realistic for the individual locations. So to increase awareness of sort of black swan events or these low probability, high risk events which are possible. Also, we are not able to put specific quantified probabilities to such scenarios. So another challenge we discussed is if we deal with natural hazards in general, but particularly also with these multi-hazards, we often rely on analyzing, assessing specific events. And so this is sort of looking at case studies all the time. So the question is, how can we draw generic results from such case study assessments? So how can we foster more comparative analysis across various case studies, which would then help us to identify generic patterns, generic processes? Excuse me. And so we had a few ideas. So one is to better link data-based and modeling-based approaches so that we could use models in various case studies and as such point to commonalities and differences. Another aspect is to collect similar or at least similar or maybe even the same data sets in the different case studies. But this would mean to come up with generic concepts about which data to collect. But this would definitely then support such cross case study comparison assessments. Because often we have these different assessments of the case studies, but they are hardly comparable. This then again brings us to the next challenge, and this is data collection. Also in the combination with open access, I think we also want to deepen the discussion about that even further. And what we have discussed is this is quite strongly related to this free rider problem. That for the whole community, it is of course a big advantage if all the data which is collected by governments, by authorities, and by scientists made open access to the whole community. On the other hand, for the individual, it is the best advantage is if you use available data and do not put additional effort into data collection and to make data accessible, because this is also an additional effort which is necessary to clean up the data, to provide metadata, and so forth. And therefore, to overcome this free rider problem, more incentives for data collection and for making data available are necessary. Because one problem we see, particularly in hydrological sciences, I'm very well aware of that collecting data and monitoring hydrological parameters is decreasing and decreasing in recent years. And there's actually the fear that with increased open access of data, this trend will continue. And we need to counteract this trend because we always see how important this empirical data is for model validation, for calibration, for assessments, and so forth. And so we come up with some ideas or observations. What incentives should there be? So of course, one should give more credit to people who collect data and make it available. So this is, for instance, citable data, data journals, and also more funding specifically for data collection. Because this is what we often observe, that funding is only available for specific novel scientific analysis. And then you can use a little bit of this money also to collect the basic data you need. Another aspect is that more and more also governments or administration should take over to collect and to monitor not only the physical parameters of natural hazards, but also, for instance, the consequences, exposure aspects, and also these risk aspects. Because I think this is also a mandate is necessary for continuous monitoring of risk parameters. Then my last point is, what support would we need to tackle such challenges? And one aspect was that we should aim, and also from the other side, there should be more openness from decision makers, local governments, and so forth, to work closer with scientists, not only in respect to data collection and making data available for science, but also to help science to develop more useful tools, for instance. And one very good example was provided by our keynote speaker, who said that generally funding opportunities are moving more and more in the direction to fund comprehensive projects which combine data collection, assessment, modeling, and management, so that also this practical aspect is included into the scientific project already. So this was it from our topic 6 discussion, and I hope that we will be able to deepen some of these aspects further in our plenary here.
Thanks a lot, Heidi. I think definitely you touched on some very important points. I mean, at least a very good link to our session, theme 7, which was about communicating natural hazards, education, and the interface between policy, public, basically the interface between science, policy, and the public, was the strong link with uncertainties. So I think this is across our 3 sessions. We've been talking about uncertainties quite a lot. So we are at the very end of it. Basically, how do we communicate uncertainties to the public and policymakers? So that was one theme we talked about, but basically for us, and we approached it as a challenge, because usually as scientists, we have a lot of uncertainties, a lot of probabilities, a lot of things that we want to communicate, and we might feel that the message doesn't come across. So one of the challenge, that was one of the challenges we identified. And as an opportunity or a take-home message, that was something we spent quite a lot of time on, was to focus the message on people, on what people, in that case, public or policymakers, want to know. So different audiences want to know different things. For policymakers, they want to know, like you mentioned, I think you, Heidi, quantify the uncertainties so they can act on it. But maybe sometimes for the public, uncertainties, they might not be very relatable. So our job as scientists or communicators is to make it real, to make it relatable to them. We need to understand the culture. What do they care about? And in a sense, people, so I think to reflect to what Gayatri was saying, uncertainties, are they possible to quantify or not? So for policymakers, they would like to know all the uncertainties and so on. For the public, maybe sometimes they just want to know yes or no. What should I do? So in that case, for us scientists, it's really important to make the message simple, like to not overwhelm them with so many details, and then people freeze, they don't know what to do, because most of the time they turn to science to really understand better so they can make better decisions. So our first part, sorry, I forgot to mention, we initially separated into breakout rooms, like one talking about the public, one talking about policymakers, but we quickly realized that actually we were talking about the same things. So we joined together for the second session, and we shared a lot of insights about approaching these two different audiences all together. So the first part was really about focusing on the message. The second part was focusing about, okay, right, we have a message. How do we convey this? So there was a clear, also that maybe sometimes we feel that as scientists, okay, we want to say something. We feel it's important for people to know, but actually, is it really what they want to know? That was the first thing. How do we engage with them? So there are different media. We've spent a lot of time talking about social media, which is very great right now. It allows us to reach a lot of people. It has metrics. We can quantify how many people receive this information and so on. It has some drawbacks, like there are a lot of hoaxes there. So we talked about that at the end. I will come back to that. But we have to keep in mind, like, okay, social media, and I know a lot of institutions, they focus a lot on this. It's only one way to reach the public, and it's most of the time a one-way street. Like we feed our channel and people receive it. Of course, they can engage, but it's one way. So there is also this importance of engaging face-to-face, because you can also reach different communities this way. Face-to-face is very important for elderlies. And in that case, if you were in our plenary where Pamela was describing her work with ladies in the Philippines, she was using workshops. So she actually goes to the community, engage them this way. So it's very important to move from a one-way street to a two-way street where we actually engage with people instead of just telling them what to do. There was a very strong, a very important comment, both from Nico and Devi from Indonesia and New Zealand, about knowing the culture to understand also who to talk to. So for example, in Indonesia, it's very important if you talk to the lead of the village, and then this person can help you convey the message. Nico was talking about the importance of reaching out to the support group, the whanau in New Zealand. So then not only you reach one person individually, but you reach a support group as well. And our last point really was about how do we build trust, because now there is so much information out there. You sometimes even information overload. So how do we build trust? How do we convey the right message and people hear this message? So I think we just also used what we discussed previously. It starts with a meaningful conversation between the people and the scientists. Like if people feel that you provide the information they need and that's usable and useful to them, then they will have trust in you. Very simple things like that. There is also the importance of very consistent messages. So not having one person saying one thing, the other person saying a different thing. As an institution, very important to have consistent messages. It could be even more useful if these consistent messages are said by different sources. So then the right message is basically amplified. So it doesn't matter really if it's good if you say one message and you consistently say it, but it's really important if also across sources, we come up with the same consistent messages so the right message comes across. And then once having this trust built, so that was a point that Nico made, we were talking a lot about hoaxes. So in Indonesia, they have a lot of them, fake eruptions and so on. So clearly we have to realize hoaxes will always be here. So either we fight against them, or there was this important aspect that Nico mentioned. Once you have trust, it could be that people actually combat hoaxes for you. So you are the trusted source and you actually have the help of the community who actually engage and pass the right message to the people. So I think that's what we came up with. So Nico, if I missed something, please go ahead. Okay. Thank you very much. That was very interesting sharing for me to see this word uncertainties coming up from all different themes and people spending quite a bit of time talking about it. So I think thanks a lot for all these summaries. We raised a lot of very interesting points. And as you mentioned, Heidi, a lot of them we can probably talk a bit more during the panel discussion, which is coming. So I would now, I would like to invite you now, all of you, so Adam, Heidi, Gayatri, and Nico, to engage in a Q&A session. So we've seen common themes, so conveying information, quantifying uncertainties, coordinating between different agencies. This is all very important. So I also welcome questions in the chat, if ever the audience has any. I have a few questions parked, so I can start by asking a few of them, and then please feel free to post any question in the chat. So the first question I have actually, and thanks, Adam, is, so we discussed about a lot of things, and that was really great to hear all about it. But what did we not discuss that you think should be discussed? So I know maybe, Adam, you've attended kind of a few sessions, so maybe you can start and then we can, oh, and Nico raised his hand already. So Adam, do you want to say a few sentences, and then we pass the microphone to Nico?
Sure, I bounced around as many times as I could to sessions, but also tried to get to the crux of what each session was about. I like the fact that there were a lot of similarities between the sessions in terms of discussions of data sharing and access and dealing with the public, and where does the science perhaps stop and the policy come over? Where does the scientist stop before they start going into a realm that they might end up getting themselves in trouble? That kind of tended to be an underlying narrative that I was getting, is that you know, there is this fine line where we can do our science, but you know, we're not, you know, I'm a physical scientist, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a policy person. So we either have to work with those people or we have to draw a line somewhere. And I thought that was a really interesting sort of theme that came throughout. And so the thing that we didn't talk about is that important framework for the development that we've been searching for decades, of the best way for physical science and its inherent uncertainties to be moved into policy and social action. Because I think that's something collectively as a field, those of us that study natural hazards, I continue to struggle with. And that's pretty much the thing I thought we need to bring in more policy people. There was a few around, but more policy people and more social scientists to get those perspectives involved. You know, one thing we're missing is the health aspects, for example, that are so important today.
Yeah, very good points, Adam. Nico, do you want to continue? I know you have expertise with science advice, so maybe you can add on actually on this as well.
Yes, so maybe just a bit of maybe a question for people who have been involved in the discussion around risks. There is a lot of effort we put in the science community to actually do quantitative risk assessments and try to, how do we actually communicate risk, etc., etc. One conversation that we probably don't have is risk tolerance, because it's not so much about the level of risk, it's how does the level of risk compares with what is actually acceptable for individuals so that they can make their own decisions, but also collectively by countries for societal risk. And I'm just curious to see from anyone who's been involved in some of this discussion, whether risk tolerance is something that came to the table, and if not, whether that's something that we should be addressing at some stage.
Heidi, did you talk about that in your session?
No, not really, but it just reminds me on an approach in Switzerland, for instance, where they use this risk aversion indicator, which they put on top. I mean, that's a quite rough, probably engineering type of dealing with this aspect, so that they just increase the risk by a certain indicator if we move to really large events, because it makes quite clear that if we have small individual accidents along the whole year, where we have 100 people affected, it's quite different as if we have one event with 100 people affected. And so, yeah, such an indicator is of course one aspect, but then also other aspects like who is able to influence the risk, who has an advantage of taking the risk, and who is suffering if something goes wrong. So there are a lot of different factors, processes, and aspects which are influencing these risk, this perception of risk, I would say. So very important topic, but indeed we in our session did not talk about it.
So maybe just to follow up, I know there is a question in the chat, but because my question is very related. So do you think it's because we miss funding for this kind of risk tolerance studies, or what? Why are we not? So it was part of this. So is it like, do we need more funding for these risk tolerance studies?
I honestly don't think so. I think what we need is more meaningful conversations around it. And just, you know, if as a scientist, we feel that one of our roles is to enable people to make better decisions. It's about the level of risk that it's about having meaningful conversation about making people understand the level of risk they might be taking and making it comparable to something they might be able to relate to, so that then they can see whether or not it's acceptable for them and make their own decisions. Yeah. And I think that's probably more the angle I would take rather than necessarily the funding approach. I think it's really the mindset that we have to change a bit at times.
It's still
just one quick comment. Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
It's still a burgeoning field. Risk analytics is only been around in the hazards concept for for just over a decade in terms of like real coordinated frameworks to assess risk. And we only just started to think about things like acceptable risk, which is what Heidi was touching on like, one event that affects 100 people, is that acceptable? But if you've got 5 events that collectively affect 100 people, is that acceptable? And this concept of acceptable risk. So I agree with Nico. It doesn't, it's always nice to have some disagreements, but we're not getting in here. I agree that we just don't, we've got a lot more conversations to have, and no, throwing huge amounts of funding at it is not going to fix that. It's about having the right conversations and providing platforms, which is exactly what we're trying to do today.
Gayatri, would you like to comment on this? Yeah, I like that idea that Sigrid also pointed out that like even like this the disaster processes or the hazard processes itself is not fully understood, and maybe we should just like putting effort on resources on that instead of like trying to quantify the complicated uncertainty analysis and also like risk, like the risk tolerance study. But I agree that as Nico said earlier, that it's in terms of better educating the community with the high risk or low risk level, and try to make them understand, like if they decide to do this, they know the risk that they are exposed to, and so to make them better judgment on what to respond in disaster in a way that it will increase their awareness of their exposed to disaster situation, something like that. So yeah, good point made by Sigrid, because we don't fully understood yet about the process. So maybe need to put effort on that. Thanks.
Heidi?
Yeah, I just want to comment in respect to this aspect where I believe that we have certain roles. No? So, I mean, this discussion a little bit, to which extent do we need to be neutral as scientists? To which extent can we get involved, or should we be involved? And to which extent can we influence or support decision makers? And I strongly believe that this uncertainty, quantification and communication to decision makers is very important, because in the end, it's a political decision in which measures, for instance, money is put and in which measures money is not put. And this is not a decision we are taking as scientists. And therefore, I think we need to enable the decision maker to make as good decisions as possible. And I mean, if we give only one number and we know that this is not true, I mean, there is always this bandwidth. And the better we know the processes, the smaller the bandwidth gets, but it will never go away due to this natural stochastic nature of natural hazards. And therefore, I strongly plead that it's necessary to communicate these uncertainties.
Thanks a lot, Heidi. So we have actually two questions related a bit to funding and resources. So I'm just going to read the question from Bruce. Where should future research funding go that is not currently or is underrepresented? So who would like to start on this? Adam, you want to start?
Sure. You know, I sit on a number of panels that look at and evaluate proposals all the time, and we always go on and on and on about interdisciplinarity and, you know, the importance of having interdisciplinary projects. But then the discussion always comes back to very siloed. This is the physical sciences panel. This is the policy panel. This is the social science panel. And so interdisciplinary science for the next 5 to 10 years is almost certainly going to be underfunded, because the funding institutions, the funding capacity beyond big programs in Europe or big international programs at the domestic level for most countries has not caught up to the idea of interdisciplinary science, the true interdisciplinary science where you have scientists, engineers, humanities, policy people all working on the same project. The funding agencies have not caught up to that, not even here in Singapore where I work. And so, you know, it's going to take time. And as a result, that's what I think interdisciplinary science is going to remain underfunded.
Thanks, Adam. Would another panelist want to comment on this?
I'll probably throw another area where I think we've got a funding gap. It's at the interface of fundamental science and operations, is operationalizing the science outputs or outcomes. And we do have some funding mechanism for research. We do have some funding mechanism for operating, whether it's monitoring network, et cetera. But actually the funding for the operationalization of the science is often missing. It's one of the big struggles we've got across a range of countries.
Good point.
Maybe just to add one aspect, what I already mentioned during my summary, and this is funding for data and making data available and providing or supporting metadata development and things like that. So often the main focus is just on science, but often science is not possible if the basic data is not collected and not available.
So if I can just jump back perhaps to the point, maybe just ask you a question, Adam. I guess I think you made a very, very good point, and I think it kind of almost comes back to the fundamental research output and how you are actually rated on your research outcomes. And maybe that's one of the fundamental questions and one of the fundamental shifts. If we are rated by the number of publication, by impact factors or whatever, we'll probably never get away from, or we'll probably never get really close to impactful science. If you've got other ways to actually really value research outcomes by whether the research gets into policy or whether it gets operational, etc., then perhaps we've got a better chance to actually make some good cases for funding. So I think maybe that's one of the angles that we need to change a little bit as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think fundamentally, I think universities and academic institutions across the planet are constantly thinking about whether they are looking at performance in the right way. And I know since I've been here now almost 12 years in Singapore, seen fundamental changes in the way that we look at academic performance over particularly 5 or 6 years, where people are saying, so what really is impact? That question is coming up. Is this person impactful? Is this person writing policy papers that are being picked up by every ASEAN country? Then that's very impactful. Now, it might not be in a high-ranking, high-impact journal, but if all of these things are changing policy in a region, then that's a fundamental achievement for that person, and they can then make that argument while they're putting together their portfolio for appraisal and promotion, for example. So yeah, that's it. I think we need to fundamentally think about the way that we look at the science that we do and what is useful. And publishing it in a journal may not necessarily be, I'm an editor, Bruce is an editor, and Heidi's an editor too, I think. I don't, publishing in a journal, we probably shouldn't be saying this, may not necessarily be the best place to get this information into the most useful domain. And that might be policy, it might be warning, it might be operational things.
Thanks, Adam. So we only have a few minutes left. So I'd like to ask the audience whether you have any question, please post them on the Q&A so then we can address them. But I can see we haven't had that many, so we can continue the discussion, but if ever you have a burning question, now is the time. So continuing on this, we have one. Should not policy be based on the consensus of research based on reviews, rather than every academic competing to be the expert who changes policy?
Good point, Brian. That is a very important point. I think that's why this, it goes to my point about interdisciplinary science. Having groups of people that are working towards very clear KPIs that stretch across different disciplines eliminates that to a certain extent. If you have these big group projects, and it goes to Bruce's question, who should fund this? Of course, they need to be funded by multiple agencies. And, I think like the funding comment I made earlier, we're still probably 4 or 5 years away from that being quite effective. But yeah, that's a great point. If you've got a big group though, then that star that is always, or that person that is always being ultra competitive is probably not going to really achieve that if you're working in a group setting.
Just want to mention, the IPCC process is a very good role model, and maybe it should, it strongly goes in this direction, to bring together all research which is available and make it available and in a language accessible for decision makers. And this close interaction also between decision makers and the IPCC is a very good example, and maybe something similar should be also used or implemented in other scientific fields.
Thanks a lot, Heidi. We have another question from Sigrid, who was asking about the transfer of knowledge and methodology from science into the public, especially at the local level. We haven't discussed that so much yet. So does anyone has a point or a comment about this, like about the transfer from science to public? So maybe Nico, as you were in the communication theme, I don't know whether you have some insights about that.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether it's really insightful, but certainly from experience, I find it highly variable with the demography and the cultures we're talking to, at the community levels. People have different problems than science. That's the reality. Kids are actually quite a good audience, I find, because they just have that innate curiosity. So you could be talking about science, you could be talking about other things. If you make it in a language that is actually interesting and fun, effectively, then you actually get a good angle there. For the rest, I think it comes down to having those meaningful conversations about what exactly are you. What are your problems? What are you trying to solve? What would be helpful? And then engaging on that rather than necessarily trying to talk about science to communities. I think it's more about how can we help you? How can we be enablers rather than teachers?
Thanks, Nico. I wonder, maybe Gayatri, do you have a point? Because I know you're on the ground, right, in Indonesia. So do you have a comment on this? The transfer of knowledge and methodology from science to the public, especially at low level.
The transfer of methodology from the scientists to public, is that?
Yeah, the knowledge methodology from science to the public, especially at the local level. We haven't discussed that too much.
Yeah.
So what's your experience with this?
Like,
I guess in terms of
like, I feel like to drag the public into the nitty-gritty of the science is going to be a long road. so I feel like it needs like some like a solid bridge to simplify what are the process of thought that we have into like the final product that we deliver to the community, and like building their trust that what we did is actually already, we put effort on it, and then like that is reasonable within our knowledge, and not like saying that you should accept it because I'm smarter than you or something like that, but it's like more building trust into like our judgment is already like, you know, proven, or like it's already several steps that they don't need to know, but they know that we did several before we get to the point that we told them this and that. And I think that's also important in building trust methods, something like that.
Yes, okay, no, that's a good point. I think that's something we touched on a little bit in Team 7. So Sigrid is actually providing another comment, which is, she was really referring to how do we make scientific findings useful for the communities without being plain scientific. So that's something we discussed in Theme 7. Yeah, thanks Gayatri and Nico for your insights already. So I think really what we discussed, at least in the session, is that we need to make it, we need to give them the information they need. So it's really by knowing them first thing, what would they find useful? So it's not really us to dictate what is useful for them to know. It's more the other way around. What do they need to know? So of course we know better what are safe zones and so on, but for them to decide on when to evacuate or how to evacuate, they have so many things to consider, right? It's like maybe Heidi and Nico, you have ideas about that, like they weigh in risks and then they make their decision. So what can we say to them to help them in this decision making? So I think maybe Nico, with evacuation, you have some experience.
Yeah, I think it's just listening, because we tend to arrive with a lens on which is our particular hazard or peril we are specialized in. So for me, it's volcanoes. For someone else, it might be earthquake or tsunami. But this actually may be only a portion of the reasons why people may want or may not want to evacuate. They may have completely different reasons not to do so or to decide to do so, whether it's cultural, whether it's societal, whether it's economic, etc., etc. And I think very often we tend to forget that. We tend to look at it through a lens, which is a scientific lens. So sometimes it's just taking off that lens and just basically listening to why are people thinking about leaving a particular area, for instance, even if you feel that it's not necessarily necessary. for instance, because the risk is not quite as acute as it could be. So I think it's just taking a bit of a humble pie. Sometimes you tell the humble pie about what we bring to the table. We always feel that it's perhaps a little bit more important than what it is. And I'm not saying we're not doing important thing. I'm saying that other people have all different views on those things.
Thanks a lot, Nico. Would someone like to comment on this before we actually, unfortunately, close the session? We are reaching the end. So
I think you bring up an important point that has the education aspect for the public in terms of like getting knowledge across requires education programs. And I'm going to answer two of Bruce's questions. One, what is not well funded is hazard education. And number two, what should we discuss at this conference that we didn't discuss in great detail? Hazard education. And so there you go, Bruce. I've answered two of your questions with one two-word answer.
Thanks, Adam. So I guess now is the time to, I pass the floor to you, Adam, for the final words.
You can pass the floor to me. I'm only going to use 2 words again, and the 2 words are, here's Bruce for the comments.
Okay, so thank you. So thank you very much. I'm just going to close the conference here, and I'd like to thank all of the attendees, the panelists, the speakers, and the scientific committee, and also Meeting Matters for the organization that they provided. We've covered a broad range of themes over the past 3 days, ranging from climate to a bit of education and communication, to multi-hazards, to remote sensing and monitoring techniques, along with a number of others. So we've covered a broad range of topics. We had about 350 people registered for the conference from 50 different countries. So that was very good. And about 110 people, 80 to 110 attending each day. And so we will be sending to you a questionnaire afterwards. We'd like to know what worked, what did not work, what you would like to see for the future. This was the 3rd iteration of this joint AOGS-EGU partnership in looking at natural hazards in Asia. And we expect to do another one next year. We're right now in discussions where that might be, because we will try to do this in person, face to face, because what we're hearing from a lot of the community is they would like to now be meeting face to face. We're hoping that in a COVID world that things will be a bit better in a year. We will see. So thank you again to everybody, and thank you for your engagement. So we will close the conference there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Bye. See you around.